Welcome to Turning Pages, a series of in-depth conversations with authors about their works. All right, well, her collection of stories, Death by a Thousand Cuts, out now through McClel and Stewart. Shashi Bhat joins me on the show. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So I'm very curious because I talked to like musicians about kind of naming albums, and sometimes the one song in particular is kind of like the title track, and there is a story called Death by a Thousand Cuts. Is this like the same kind of thing where like this was clearly the title track?
No. Originally, when I submitted the manuscript to my agent, it was called We're All in This Alone, which is the title of one of the other stories.
Hmm.
But my publisher had published a book that had a similar title. So I looked at the other story titles, and now I really prefer the title Death by a Thousand Cuts. I think it gets at that theme of accumulating small harms. And it's a theme that is present in some way in every story in the book.
So you didn't see this necessarily as the titular story originally, but you've come to kind of realize what it contains.
Yeah, exactly.
So then what was it about that, your initial idea? Like, why did you think that was the one that kind of was emblematic?
Do you mean the previous story or this one?
The we're all in this alone, like the like why that why was
Oh
that the
yeah.
title for you versus what became the title?
Yeah, what I just like kind of the sound of it and the kind of like the playful, like the wordplay. But I think the collection has this pervasive feeling of loneliness and isolation. Like the way I held the idea of the collection in my head was it's about the isolation of being a woman and having a body. And I thought that original title kind of hinted at that.
Okay. Yeah, and I now that you like explain that, I get like to me, yes, the title that your publisher suggested, like this does make sense, but what you're saying also makes sense. So when it came time to kind of like collecting these stories, like did you have other stories that didn't quite fit thematically, or had you written
Yes.
kind of like all around this same topic right now? Like what was kind of like the process of like figuring out what was part of this book?
Yeah, so I had in my original manuscript 19 stories,
Oh,
and now it's just nine. And like I had stories with male protagonists, and the theme was definitely less cohesive. And my agent at the time, who's now my publisher, she said to me, like, I think these stories are really about women. And I thanked her for that in my acknowledgments because I think she was really right. So I removed the stories with male protagonists. I also ended up rewriting one of the stories from like a man to a woman character. And then once I started working with my editor, we did further honing and got it down to just the nine that we felt were the strongest and that held together in a cohesive theme.
which story was originally written from a male perspective?
Giantess.
Okay. Did changing that, like the gender of the central character, like
Mhm.
change the tone of it for you?
Yeah, it was really interesting because I had written that story originally as a piece of flash fiction. It was inspired by a student I had like a decade ago who told me people called him the library giant. And the story is, of course, about a giant who works in the library.
Hmm.
And I just thought that name was so like beautiful and kind of sad. And the story has nothing to do with the student, by the way, I should say. Um, but yeah, so I wrote that story. I developed it into a full-length story, and then I was just really attached to it. So I thought, can I try and write this about a woman instead? And it really clicked for me because now I think it's a story about a woman who is afraid to take up space and kind of fighting against her true nature in a way. I think its meaning is deeper now that it's a woman.
Yeah, the taking up space aspect, like it ties into kind of an offhand thing that's mentioned in the story about the hair, about like cutting off the hair to take up less space, like that there's
Mhm.
always kind of this uh impetus or pull to like shrink yourself in these
Mhm.
characters. Uh, as far as this like library giant anecdote that you mentioned, like do you find inspiration from things like that often? Like, do you find that there's like kind of the kernel of an idea from just like an offhand comment or some small kernel of something?
Yeah, now I'm looking at inspiration for the other stories and where they came from. Like sometimes it is just an offhanded phrase or a sentence that I hear, or sometimes something a little bit weird happens to me in real life where there's like something fixes an image in a mind and in my mind and I become kind of obsessed with it and that leads to a story.
So then, because I'm very always curious about the process, like, do you find that like a character comes first for you in a story, or do you have like an inciting incident or something that you kind of want to like work around or towards? Like, how do you kind of build out a story?
Yeah, it varies so much, but often it's like a feeling of discomfort that provides that tension for a story. And then from there, that suggests characters and a theme. Or like I'm thinking about the first story in the collection, Deal Breaker, and that one, like, I mean, I've been on many uncomfortable dates, so there's, those kinds of feelings in there. But the real inspiration for like that shaped the story was I read this book called The Gift of Fear. It's by, I think his name is Gavin de Becker. He's a security expert, and it's a book that's often recommended to women on Reddit. And one of the things he explores is how people, women in particular, will often suppress or ignore their fear instinct out of politeness. And that for me provided the trajectory of the story. This woman who's on a series of dates with a man she meets on an app, and he does these things that make her subtly uncomfortable, but she just keeps ignoring it, and telling herself, this is okay, and then it's not okay.
Yeah, it feels well, in the same way, it's like a thousand cuts, right? Like like it's not the title of the story, but like in that kind of like aggregate sense, right? Like grains of sand, and suddenly you're buried.
Yeah. Yeah, that's just what I was going for.
Um, so that one, obviously, he's like you said, came from another book, and the idea behind it, and then you build the story. So like, do you come up with kind of like a dating situation or a person? Like how are you like kind of structuring things? Like, do you think of like who this person is first or what they're going through?
I think of the situation first, and then the situation to me like requires a certain kind of character. Like I think that story needed a woman who was going to be polite in those
Hmm.
situations. I think a different character would have left that date a lot earlier.
There seems to be kind of something to say about like kind of the addictive nature of like dating apps though within this, that like even though she goes through this terrible situation, like at the end she's kind of going back towards it.
Yeah, and it's I think partly the dating app, and then also like what I wanted to get at is these societal expectations placed on women. Like she feels a compulsion to date, even though she's quite a successful not Indian, independent woman. And like at one point she says her life is exquisite, except for this one thing that she doesn't have. And I think that's a pressure that comes from outside of her.
Right. I think she says like if I don't stop to think about it, I don't realize I'm missing it.
Mhm. Yeah.
Now, is that like a societal or a cultural, or like kind of is it both, and like kind of more so because of the kind of the fact that it's both of those things?
Yeah, I am interested in like the way a character's intersecting identities affects their experience. So for her, like maybe that story doesn't delve as much into like family or cultural pressures, though I think I have other stories in here that
Hmm.
do. For her, I think it's just kind of the world she lives in and this like compulsion of the app. It's like all those things mixing together. But yeah, I do have other stories where I think the cultural stuff comes more explicitly into play.
how conscious are you of writing that in or considering that? Like, do you find that you just kind of naturally go there, or are you wanting to kind of bake that in?
Yeah, I think maybe it comes naturally because like that's my lived experience. It's another thing that's interesting to me is like I think of this book as being about women, and I've read like reviews and pieces about it that say like, oh, all the protagonists are South Asian women, and it's actually not true. Like I think only like maybe half of the protagonists are identified as like South Asian women.
Hmm.
But I think people make that assumption based on who I am or a detail like a character having black hair. So it is something that I explore, but I think of the collection as being more broadly about women.
It's interesting because in the story about Arthi, there's a kind of offhanded comment about she doesn't want to be guilted into a relationship with a fluffy-haired man who didn't understand that all novels were fictional. Like that, the separation of the artist from the art, or like the notion that like this is you as a protagonist in some sense in all of these stories. Like how much do you find of yourself in things because you're obviously writing from what you know versus like how much you bristle at being kind of connected to everything you write.
Yeah, and I know that's always an assumption that people are going to make that my stories are autobiographical. I do draw from personal experience fairly often, but I'm also drawn to the freedom of fiction. Like I want to write the story the way it should have happened, or the way I wish it happened, or the better story, the story that better gets across the idea. And then I'm also drawn to the cloak of fiction. Like I think it takes a brave person to write a memoir, or to maybe I should say to publish a memoir. And I know, like, I'm thinking of a story in here where it did really come from personal experience, but in real life, there was so much more. And in revising it, I had conversations with my editor about, like, how specific should this be, and achieving that balance where it was specific enough to feel real, but not so specific that it stopped feeling universal or relatable, for lack of a better word.
What does that conversation look like? Like, are you asking them like, have I revealed too much, or is this just like, have I gone down a rabbit hole? Like, what are you getting at with them when it comes to that kind of discussion?
Yeah, I mean, in that case, it was kind of like, does this stuff need to be here? Like kind of like the pruning and like clearing away things so that the real essence and intention of the story come through and it's not cluttered. Like with that story, I'm talking of the yeah. I guess like with that story, I know I cut probably 1,000 words from it, and I think it just became a much stronger story having all of that kind of clutter cleared away.
Is the editing of a short story a different thing than like a longer piece? Like, do you find that because you are trying to kind of like hit like a specific kind of size, you're more ruthless or like more exacting?
I I find it more approachable than editing a novel because you can like hold the whole thing in your mind all at
Mm.
once. And physically look at it all at once. Like I will, when I'm revising, print out a story. So I have the paper copy. I'll go at it with different colors of highlighter. I'll take scissors and cut it up and put it on my floor and move things around. Whereas you can't really do that with a novel. I mean, you can do it in sections, but not in the same way. So just that, like being able to look at it all at once, I like with short stories.
Right. If you had a novel, like you maybe have had chapters that were in different timelines, you could kind of like sift through and like resort them, but I don't think you could kind of like really see the overview the way you would with a
Mhm.
short story. When it
Yeah.
comes time to kind of like editing, like do you ever have regrets as to like something you really wanted to include but feel you need to cut?
That has happened. I just save those in a file on my computer. Usually I don't end up doing anything with them, and I grow less attached to them over time.
It's like, oh, I'll use this later, but you never come back to it, kind of.
Yeah, like I have those files and folders, but yeah, I doubt there's enough there for a story.
Sure enough. Um, so I was going back to the titular short story. There's a passage that says, "How do you decide when to push back and when to let something go?" And obviously, this is like kind of like, where do you take a stand? And this is to me like kind of maybe the thing that ties all the stories together. That
It's really
like each
interesting.
character kind of reaches a point where maybe that's the decision they're making.
Hmm.
Do you see that, or am I
Yeah.
reading into that?
No, I can see that because I think that's something I wrestle with on my own too. Like when when is it worth disrupting a situation? Um, yeah, well, like even in Deal Breaker, for example, there are all of those small things, those uncomfortable moments, and in hindsight, that character might say, like, "Oh, I should have known to leave then." But in the moment, I think it's a much tougher decision.
Right. Um, in terms of the like you said, like kind of the recurrent thing is, contemporary women in society. How much are you pulling from like people you know? Like, are you asking people if you are borrowing from their lives experiences, like, can I use this? Like, is that something that you do?
Not really. I think for the most part, if I'm writing from personal experience, it's my own personal experience. I do things like talk to my parents and listen to the sounds of their voices to capture like the way a character speaks, syntax. But I rarely take someone else's like whole story and put it in my fiction. I have done things, not so much with this collection, but with past books, like asking people permission. But mostly, I think I do a lot of kind of like collaging and Frankensteining, where like characters and situations wouldn't really be recognizable.
So there wouldn't be one of your friends who's like, oh, this is me. You took this.
I hope not.
I was just curious because even in Deal Breaker, like there's obviously her friends that, she's texting with or like kind of relating to about, owning their own places and the bad dating experiences and stuff. And I was curious if that's possibly ripped from some experiences you knew
Oh
about
no,
or
those are totally
just the
fictional
universal.
people. I just made those women up.
Sure enough. Technology. I'm curious, like,
Mhm.
could you have written a version of this that didn't have, the apps and the technology? Or do you find that
Oh.
it's so inextricably tied to like our current condition that you can't write a contemporary piece without it?
Huh. That's a really interesting question because I think I always had this idea growing up that literary fiction had to be free of technology and like timeless, unless you were like Ray Bradbury or something. Could the stories be written without technology? Some of them could. Um, like like the series of dates a character goes on could just be with someone she meets at a bar instead. But I do think it would lose a layer of commentary on our like current contemporary life. Or like the story Am I the Asshole, for example.
Mm.
That story I don't think could be done without the Reddit post, or I would have to find some other way of doing it because I think one of the things it's exploring is how like we outsource our moral choices to the internet, or how something that happens online can catalyze something that happens in real life. So I think it is part of the like thematic center of the story.
I'm glad you mentioned that one because I did want to get to that one. Like, do you spend time on Reddit? Is that like,
I do too much time. Like since the pandemic in particular. Before that, I was never on there.
and do you post or you just like lurk and read things? Or is like, what's your relationship to something like that?
I'm more of a lurker, but I do sometimes comment. So this is, yeah, I didn't explore this so much in this book, but I think it's really interesting how there are these little like enclaves of women on Reddit. Yeah, it's a whole thing, but I do sometimes interact on there.
Is that grist for a future story in terms of like those enclaves, or is that just kind of a realization you've made just, as someone who participates in that?
It's definitely material for a future story.
You mentioned, obviously the pandemic and like the pandemic impacts that story and there's, obviously, impacts everyone's lives. How conscious were you of writing about that? Like thinking, at a certain point, do people want to read stories like this at this point?
Yeah, so like that story I know makes reference to the pandemic. I think it like heightens the tension a little bit because the woman and her boyfriend are just have been spending so much time together.
Hmm.
I think the story where it features most prominently is We're All in This Alone. And there I was thinking consciously about the pandemic. So I'm immunocompromised. So during the pandemic, I spent a lot of time alone, and I wanted to write about that, like personal experience of isolation within this larger context of what everyone was going through. So yeah, that's the one where I was consciously thinking about it.
And there was just no way around like writing about that at this point in time.
Yeah, and it felt like an opportunity too. Like, when have any of us lived through something like that?
Uh, Money is an aspect of a lot of these stories.
Hmm.
In Deal Breaker, the woman is, you know, like kind of anxious or nervous to like relate that her condo, she owns it outright, right? That she's
Yeah.
okay financially, right? You introduce the ideas of foodie calls, and there's like, often kind of people negotiating between each other around access to money or who's
Mhm.
going to pay for what. How much was that something that you were kind of like thinking about as like a universal for these stories?
Yeah, maybe less as a universal, but there are definitely stories that get into that, like privilege and relative privilege and how it ties into gender in Deal Breaker. Like the man she's on a date with, there's kind of like an emasculation because of she's quite independent, successful, and owns her own place. And I think he makes some kind of dig at her about that. And then the other story where it comes into play is What You Can Live Without. And that one, I mean, I'm just kind of pathologically frugal. Like, I'm someone who reads the grocery flyers and chooses what I'm going to eat based on sales. And I'm just like, I think about that a lot. But I think there's like, I wanted to explore the difference between like frugality and cheapness and like generosity and what that means in a relationship and comparing like different ways of being around money.
You mentioned frugality versus cheapness. Yeah, that there's like either like a moral stance or like a mindset between the two that like you create a distinction or a differentiation between and that the characters kind of have like wrestle with. Was that
Yeah.
something that you yourself were wrestling with and then, you know, brought that internal debate onto the page, or was that something that you've already kind of settled for yourself?
Hmm. Yeah, it is something I think about. I guess because like I got in that story, there are the parents and like her father for that character's father, for example, is very generous with his money, but the generosity comes from like his thinking and feeling too. It's not just money. So I am interested in those nuances and like how like how thoughtfulness comes into play there too. I think gift giving is such an interesting thing to write about. And I forget what the line is in the story, but how like asking someone the question, like, what's the best gift you've ever given can really tell you a lot about them.
Right, it's a litmus test of some sort. The money sometimes manifests in terms of, buying meals, and food kind of plays a central role as well, no more so than in Indian cooking.
Hmm.
Is food kind of top of mind when you're writing? Like, do you think about kind of like how people interact with food or relate to food because everybody eats?
I think I personally just am thinking about food all the time, so maybe it just enters the stories. I think I could actually have written a lot more about food than I did. In Indian cooking, like that's a story where I was thinking about the cultural layer of things because like so it's the mother has a like a facial injury while she's frying an Indian snack to give to guests that are coming to their house, and she's cooking Indian food because she wants to like give this certain impression when normally she would just serve Triscuits or whatever.
Hmm.
So thinking a bit there about like what food says about the character.
And also, I guess what the character thinks about food as it relates to like, their presentation in the world, right? Like
Yeah.
that like she's not gonna make these patties, but like she'd normally open that box of Triscuits, but she has to kind of put on a show for other people.
Yeah, and I think that maybe ties into the story's larger themes about like appearance and identity, which is another theme that
Hmm.
surfaces in a couple of places.
Absolutely, right? Like that, even going back to Deal Breaker and the appearance of like, yeah, the two-bedroom condo and owning it and outright and stuff, that
Mhm.
all the appearances. Um, Now that the book is out, like, have there been any surprises? Like, have you had any reactions to specific stories, like where you're surprised by what readers are reading into it?
Hmm. Interesting. I don't know if there are reactions to specific stories, but I have been surprised by how many people seem to relate to it, which, yeah, that it feels great, honestly.
Understandably. Well, Death by a Thousand Cuts, as I said, out through McClellan and Stewart. Shashi, thanks very much for taking some time to talk about it, and congratulations on its release.
Oh, thank you so much.